And this is my side profile. Hey, how you doing? Hopefully you're doing well today. I am doing just peachy keen. Thank you for asking. I'm here in the Atlas Plateau. Or is it Altus? Wait, no, I think... Oopsie. It doesn't say. I think it's Atlas? But here, let's see. Because now I must be correct. I am required to be correct. Okay, it doesn't tell me. Erd Tree Gazing Hill. Well, you can gaze at the Erd Tree from here. So if you're into that, I mean, look. It's up there. Being beautiful. Tree-like, even. Today I was going to talk a little bit about perceptions of reality and how they affect our daily living. I have recently been in a couple of conversations that were interesting about like the nature of perception and reality. One of them, I would say both of them were kind of not really fruitful, but they were kind of interesting to me for the way people reacted. And in both of them, the kind of the same subject was coming up, but like I'll point to one of the conversations where I think it's much clearer why people were. Oh my. Jab. Give, please, thank you. Very much. I like. But okay, so basically what happened was I joined a bunch of random religion servers. I've been looking for some good ones just to have discussions in. And there was one that was smaller, and at first I thought it might be kind of interesting. But I think the first day I was there, I had some discussions with the people in there, or with a couple of them, and I immediately... See, I have this thing. My thought, and this is important to me in the way we perceive things. To me, it would appear that all knowledge is based in a sense on assumptions, and it's all based on in a certain level of faith. And a good example of this is you might believe that Shakespeare wrote something, and you might have ideas about what he intended when he wrote something, and you know that he was a real person, etc., etc. But to get to that point where you're making these assumptions, you already have to make a ton of different assumptions. Like to assume that you can understand what someone is writing and why they are writing it is, to me, a little bit silly. You can make the assumption. Excuse me, sorry. You can make the assumption, but you are always forever separated from that person. You can never know for sure why they have written something, what they are intending to write with something, that your particular interpretation of it is the quote-unquote correct one, or that there even is a correct one. Like, you see, just by one thing, we're already talking about a ton of different assumptions. Now, I would say you can, on a certain level, apply that to all information and knowledge. On some level, all information and knowledge requires you to have faith. And even if it's just the faith that you are able to perceive certain things and that you perceive things correctly. Now, this goes into the radical skepticism and a whole lot of things like this. But this is an important point to me because, you know, people walk around and they make assumptions about, or they talk about like how much they know and they know better than someone else. And maybe to a certain extent they may be correct or incorrect. But once you realize that everyone is kind of going through this process and they have to rely on their senses that can be inaccurate, and they have to rely on their own mind, and they have to rely on their own intellect, and they have to rely on the information they have, and the tremendous amount of ignorance and assumptions that are made in every step of that process. And I don't like the turtle. I don't want to eat the turtle bits. But, you know, like in every part of that process, there are so many assumptions that have to be made. And the other person is working with what they have. So while you're having a conversation, what? Oh, they can harm each other. I didn't know that. But like during conversations, during every moment, everything is like at a level of abstraction almost immediately. And I think you should give other people the benefit of the doubt that possibly they're misunderstanding something, or that you're misunderstanding something, or that, for instance, people are not necessarily always malicious. Sometimes they're simply misinformed. And you got to think about like all the times you've been misinformed in your life, and all the little silly things that you've done, like especially when you were younger and things like that. But this is important to me because I think it really forms a core layer of my worldview and the skepticism I hold towards the idea of epistemology, in the sense that you can truly know things and that on some level you can ever escape from the idea of having a certain amount of faith. Now, right off the bat, you can kind of see how if someone has a very literalist or has a very conservative view of scripture or religion or pretty much anything, or the idea of epistemology, this is going to conflict with them. You can see that. Now, I like to share this opinion, and I like to kind of see what people say. And, people disagree. I've had a few people kind of come to agree after I've explained it, and then a lot of people go, they don't get it. And, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to get it. I just like sharing the idea. And, yeah, okay, it is Altus, not Atlas, Altus. But, they were talking about the Gospels. And I pointed out that, you don't really know 100% for sure why somebody wrote the Gospels, and you never really can. And I was just trying to point out that, like, basically you have to make 1,000,000,001 assumptions before you can even get to the idea of the Gospels. You have to make assumptions about your own sources. You have to make assumptions about why people wrote what they wrote. And you can do that. But it was more an attempt to point out that there's a reason that maybe you should be a little bit more skeptical and not talk about the idea of, like, I know for 100% sure why people did this. And real quick, I kind of got the impression that it wasn't going to go anywhere. Because, well, first off, the first person I talked to, because this is kind of a two-parter, the first person I talked to was, I would argue, just straight up not understanding what my point was. They just kept saying, we can trust the Gospels. Which, I mean, you can trust the Gospels. I would say, even argue that I trust the Gospel to a certain extent. I mean, how can we... Like, when I talk about the teachings of Jesus, I am speaking about the teachings of Jesus that we have within mostly the synoptic Gospels, as well as the Gospel of John. Like, that's what I'm talking about. I would also maybe, to a certain extent, depending on who I'm talking to about this, I might also include things like the Gospel of Thomas, or maybe some Gnostic Gospels. But I think if we're talking about a historical Jesus, there's reason to believe that the synoptic Gospels give us at least some kind of a glimpse into that. Does that necessarily mean I'm 100% sure? No, but whatever. That's not that big of a deal. So they were completely missing my point and attempting to tell me that, no, you have to trust the Gospels, and that was right off the bat. It was just like already like, okay, never mind. I don't even know why I bothered bringing it up. I don't think I'm actually serving anybody by bringing it up. Another person, there was a second person in the first part of the conversation who at least kind of eventually got to understand what I was talking about. I don't think they agreed, but they at least understood it a little bit better. And I'm not even 100% sure how much they understood, but they seemed to at least understand that that was what I was trying to point out, and that, it kind of got derailed and went to a whole other realm. I should have realized before I even started that it was going to do that. But, whatever. And then I thought that we would kind of move past it, and the first person who just kept saying that, yeah, trust the Gospels, it's like, okay. Then there was another person who responded basically the next day. I think it was, like way early in the morning next day. And they responded, and they were talking about all kinds of different stuff. And like, they said, and I was trying to explain to them too, that this is like the idea that everything's based on assumptions. You can never truly know things, and you have to rely on your experience. And even your experience, you can't like 100% know for sure. But if you're going to rely on something, an experience makes sense. And even then, like your memory could be bad, all kinds of other things, blah, blah, blah. But the idea is that, like, there is a higher truth. The higher truth here is what I would be talking about, is like everything is based on assumption, and epistemology is at the very least incredibly difficult, if not outright impossible on some level. and that reality is kind of a construct that we make rather than a quote-unquote real thing. And they said that I was being an intellectual coward because the conversation after that kind of divulged into, well, if you don't care and if you really think this, then why are you talking about it? Why argue about it? It's like, well, I'm not really even arguing. I'm just, well, I guess it is technically arguing, but I always just have the association of when someone says argue, like more emotional investment, I guess. It was more along the lines of, I think it's interesting to talk about. And I mean, we don't even have to agree. In fact, you could say, if you just don't want to talk about it, we could just not talk about it and move on to something else. And it very quickly got to me realizing that this person didn't really care what I had to say. They were already treating it like a debate. I'm like, well, you can disagree, and maybe you can bring out a point that I haven't considered. That is true, but everything they were saying was stuff I had already considered, was stuff I, knew about and had my reasons for believing, and we could get into that, but I didn't really think they wanted to, honestly. And then they said, well, this seems to me that on some level there's a big contradiction here. And I'm like, there is, because if I acknowledge on some level that you can't know things, but then I talk about knowing things, then yeah, there is a bit of a contradiction here. But what I'm talking about is that this is the grand scheme. The higher truth here is that you can't really know things for 100% certainty. The quote lower truth, if you want to call it that, and I don't know if it's really a good idea to scale it, but I think it makes more sense if I do it like that, is that in your everyday life, the idea that you cannot know things for certain or that you cannot be 100% certain about things is actually not very important. Like, I cannot be 100% certain why I do certain things, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to do them. And I can't be 100% certain that something is good for me or that I'm doing something the right way, but I'm going to continue to do them simply because I exist. I'm not going to just stop all of my doing because I don't know if there's a grander purpose or if I have a grander knowledge about how things really are, and that on some level I'm not basing them all on assumptions and my own beliefs and experiences, which can be faulty. Like, I understand this. I understand that that's the case. However, for my everyday truth and for my everyday life, that truth is fairly irrelevant. Like, yes, we cannot know for sure what Jesus actually said and did, or that Jesus was like 100% a person. We can make assumptions, and we can say based on the information we have, it makes at least some sense to believe that Jesus was definitely a historical figure. I think he was definitely a historical figure. And that he has probably had certain beliefs, and that people died for those beliefs and all that. I don't even think that's really that big of a deal. Separating yourself from like this higher truth that is like, bigger and encompasses everything, and just the daily practice and the daily activities that you have is something that I do, and I don't really think it's that much of a contradiction. You could argue it's a contradiction to hold two beliefs at the same time, but I'm not even really saying that these beliefs necessarily completely disagree with each other. It's just that you cannot know for sure, but that doesn't mean that you can't live your life and you can't, oops. This guy's a meanie bobini. I can't stun him. This is probably one of the bigger problems. Like, I think it's an important epistemological truth, and especially one if you're trying to examine yourself and examine the truth of, scripture or the truth of philosophy, something that I think you need to consider and something that is important to know. But once again, in my daily life, if I'm just driving to work or if I'm just making a silly Billy video, it doesn't really matter. Like, that's not like something that's like, oh my god, always in the forefront of my brain screaming at me, and then I have to consider every second. I don't think they were even willing to accept that. I don't think they were willing. And then, so they called me an intellectual coward, and I'm like, okay. And then it turned into a whole thing where, like, they started they said, well, this all started because I questioned the infallibility of the Gospels. And I'm like, well, yeah, I don't necessarily think they're like, infallible. That seems like an odd... How long are you gonna keep doing that, bud? I will jab you, and then you die. Thank you. Can I have fruit? Actually, do you even have fruit? Poison bloom. Miranda Brown. Okay. Whatever. That's fine, too. You know, like... And then it turned out... It was like, I guess that wasn't really what I was even trying to say. I guess I would talk about that and say that I don't necessarily think the Gospels are infallible. I don't really think anything is, like, truly infallible like that. Hi. Can he get up here? I wonder. Okay, so he can. Nope. Got him both now. Wait, can I get them to, like, get back over here and, like, just jab at them a bunch? I bet you I could. Okay, so... Well, this is kind of funny. Okay, there, that one's dead. This is silly. Oh, I think that just makes his shield better. It's just a blessing for his shield, right? Oh, it teleports. Huh. That's interesting. I didn't even know he would do that. I don't think I've ever fought these guys and had that happen. I mean, there we go. And then it turned into a whole thing where, like, he was talking about, well, okay, so why did people die for the teachings of Jesus and all these other things? And I was like, well, you know, they probably believed him, or, well, he didn't say teachings. He said the divinity of Jesus. And I was like, well, you know, they either A, they believed that he was God, or, you know, maybe he was God, or all that stuff. I mean, I pray to him as an aspect of the divine, but they just seemed to kept insinuating that I didn't believe in the Gospels at all, or I didn't believe in Jesus at all. It was very weird. I've had a lot of these conversations where, like, if I introduce a slightly complicated, or, well, okay, maybe more than slightly complicated, esoteric point, or like a philosophical point, or a religious point, people just will just get to this thing where they just don't either, and don't get it, and that's not necessarily always their fault. Sometimes maybe I'm just explaining it poorly, you know? That's certainly possible. And I wouldn't, like, begrudge them, like, their understanding, especially if I was just saying it in a way that was not, you know, helpful for their understanding, or if it was just, like, some minor thing and I'm just not explaining it in the bestest way, which is possible. Of course. But, I kept having this happen. Like, more than once. And sometimes I'm like, okay, well, this is just, maybe I'm just explaining it poorly. And then, like, after I'll examine the conversation a little bit and I'll just realize that it's just like, oh, okay, I kind of understand why they thought I was saying this, because I didn't, the way I was explaining it, I could see where you'd come to that conclusion. But I've had more than a few times where it just seems like whoever I'm talking to is just not even remotely listening. And, it's like, it seems like they're not even trying to listen. And, they don't have to listen, but if we're not listening to each other, then why are we even having the discussion, Like, that's the way I feel, at least. And it's not even that, like... And I'm not going to say I've never done that in an argument either. I've tried, especially as I have done this more, and tried to share my, like, religious ideas with people more, I've definitely tried more and more to make sure I'm listening and understanding what the other person is saying. I'm not always good at it, and sometimes there'll be like language barriers or things like that, and I know it can be frustrating too if someone's like having a discussion and it just seems like neither party is really getting what the other person is trying to say, which I've noticed happens a lot, especially online, which is part of the reason why, like, I now have this policy where if we get to a point in the conversation where I have to just start repeating what I've already said, and it's very clear that they're not either they're not responding to my point or they're just not getting it, then it's just like, okay, look, I just don't think we're gonna get anywhere by having this, and I'm just gonna stop now, because it's like I don't get anything out of arguing with people. I do like the idea of having a little intellectual conversation discussion, but even then, I don't. People don't have to agree with my point of view, but it is nice if I share it for people to at least understand what I'm saying. But I find in a lot of conversations, especially if you introduce people to ideas that are a little bit outside of the norm, it seems like there's a good portion of time when shouldn't what's his face have spawned by now? Oh. Oh, he's that guy. I have mini flame ambition, maybe have. Ouchie. This is a very good shield. Especially because you can do that. Later, guy. Later, my guy. But like, and part of the reason I wanted to bring this up is because I personally think that there is a great deal of wealth to be had in these discussions, and that you can really share a wealth of ideas and knowledge and information. But you should always remember that if it gets to a point where the two of you are either A, just completely and totally disagreeing, and you're not, and it doesn't seem like either of you are going to budge, remember that it's okay to be like, hey man, I don't really want to like argue. And that's the thing. To me, a lot of times is like, if we're gonna sit here and like argue, and that's what we're gonna be doing, it's just like I immediately lose quite a bit of my interest. I'm not interested in sitting here and trying to convince someone of my opinion. I mean, I'm interested in sharing that opinion and having it challenged, and challenging other people and seeing what they believe and why. But in a lot of cases, it's just turns into a thing where it's like, okay, what are we actually doing here? Are we just here to argue? And some people too. Sometimes you'll get into conversations with people like online or even in person, and then it will become obvious to you as you're paying attention that, oh, this person just wants to argue. And don't assume that everyone's just out there to argue, but sometimes the longer you spend with somebody talking to them, you start to realize that that's really what they're about. They're really about like this idea of being right and making sure. Oh, hey, how you doing? Are you gonna attack? You are. And and remember, it's okay, and that people can be wrong, or people can have a different opinion of than you do, or think about things in a different way, and you don't always have to A, fight them on it, and B, people are allowed to exist, man. But you're also allowed to exist. You don't have to justify like all of your thoughts and feelings to everyone that like wants to come to you. And like in a lot of cases, you'll get into spiritual communities where like you might really like the people there, but they strongly disagree with you on something, and that doesn't mean you gotta discard them or get rid of them. And the only time maybe it's a good idea to try and step away from people who have vastly different opinions is not just because they have different opinions, but because you feel like they're hurting your spiritual journey, and they're making it harder for you to progress along the path that you want to progress on. Not a mean Jimmy Ding? But yeah, that's just some thoughts and ideas that I wanted to share. And uh, I think it's important to remember that you have a right to have your opinions, and you have a right to feel safe and to feel validated, and know that you don't always have to argue with people. And even if you do want to argue with people and have discussions, remember that if it's not productive and it just feels like people are just, you know, being negative, big silly billies and stuff like that, just know that sometimes it is very okay to just be like, I'm bowing out, and that it's okay that doesn't mean you've lost. That's another thing. I know a lot of people will do this weird thing. It's like, since you want to withdraw from our little debate, that means you've lost. It's like, well, I mean, if we are having a debate and it just feels like it's fueled by negativity and people, you know, not caring about other people's feelings and only being interested in like proving how right they are, it's like, understand that it is perfectly okay to just be like, yeah, nah, man, I'm out. Bye bye, birdies. And, understand that you don't owe anybody anything in terms of like having to justify your faith or lack of faith. If you want to have that conversation with people, uh, you know, cool, and hopefully you can do it in a safe environment. But remember that ultimately you need to make sure that you're okay, and that you're not just wasting your time in negativity. And and this also goes the other way, though. Make sure that you're not just spreading negativity for no reason, and that you're just trying to argue. Okay. Okay, well, hopefully you all enjoyed my little conversation. Look, there's some fire slug things. That's cool. And I hope that you all have a wonderful time, and I hope that you all have a great day. All right, love you. God loves you. Bye bye. Bye bye. Love you. Bye.